My HOA are incompetent scum. My father stalks them until they resign. Takedown posted by a Zuriach hermit. So I live in a relatively new suburban neighborhood with a homeowners association, an HOA, that has been slowly getting more annoying. My father, a paranoid, vengeful Republican retired civil engineer, is the main disperser of the revenge. Here's a list of their earlier offenses. About 5 years ago, they sent us a notice to move our garbage bins out of the street, and if they were left outside of the backyard after garbage day for too long again, they would fine us. Our garbage bins were not in the street. We were also very good about putting our garbage bins away promptly after they sent us a warning after we left them out during a week-long vacation. They somehow mixed up our house with our neighbors. My dad spray painted our lot number on the bins so that this wouldn't happen again. The rest of the neighborhood slowly followed suit. From what I hear, the security guard the HOA hired is also paid to look for infractions on each lot, but apparently is not paid enough to get the lot numbers right, so this happened several times. The light on our address number hasn't worked since the house was built, and we bought immediately after it was finished, because the construction job was rather shoddy. 6 years later, somebody from the HOA finally noticed and told us that we had to pay to fix it, even though it was due to an electrical fault on the part of the builders. They also demanded a picture to prove that we fixed it. My father opened the box where the light was, put a glow stick in, and took a picture at night, and then sent it in, the address light seemingly fixed. They bought it. They even tried to force all members of the neighborhood into this poorly designed social network for our neighborhood. Nobody liked it, and the network was barely even used by the HOA. Not announcing HOA meetings except a day or two before the meeting by posting the times on a dilapidated board at the park at the center of the neighborhood. The paper often falls off and blows away, so the meetings were not often attended by anybody until recently because of the big offense that follows. Here's the big one that set my dad off. There is apparently a clause in the HOA guidelines that, every so often, we must have the house repainted. The first time to do this came up last year. There was a lot of crappy bureaucracy involved, like having to submit a request to do the mandated painting. And then the whole neighborhood was mandated to use these expensive, not particularly good paints that couldn't be bought anywhere nearby except from a posh, overpriced supplier some 100 miles away. My father, being a cheapskate, said screw that, and he got a small-time guy, real friendly, to do the job on the cheap and use paints that were one tone off, but were more durable and cheaper because they could be bought in bulk from the big store down the street. He does a great job in just 2 hot summer days, doing all the work with just him and, I believe, 2 others, all on the cheap. A few months later, when everybody else was repainting their houses, we get a notice that our house is not painted according to code and submit a new request to repaint our house or face penalties. My dad was steaming because he was pretty sure the only reason they required us to use those colors was because the paint company was paying them to, and the house looked great. He endured months of poorly managed bureaucracy. He kept sending the request to repaint the house, and they kept playing around, losing the request, not keeping him notified of the matter, delaying the processing until it neared the deadline to paint the house. If we overshot the deadline, we would be fined. He demanded that they just fine him, bribe, for using the wrong paint and not force him to repaint with the overpriced crappy paint. They wanted to make an example of us and have him come before a disciplinary committee, and my father wouldn't let this stand. While they kept playing bureaucratic games, my father started his revenge games. He got somebody in the HOA to tell him where the offices of their management was, and he went there to demand to speak with them, to complain, and ask for information on the proceedings. Because it was so far out of the way and hard to figure out where it was, and he made such a fuss, they panicked. He went again a week later, and they had beefed up security and denied him entry unless he had an appointment. When he met with the disciplinary committee, there was an armed security guard there. My father pulled out all of his know-how as a civil engineer and told them that the paint they were using was subpar, overpriced, and it was clear that they had no experience in the field and needed a consultant. They politely declined his services and tried to get him to pin all the blame on the painter, which he refused to do as he authorized the painter to cheap out on the paint. As punishment, they forced us to repaint in a different, much uglier color that's completely out of place for the neighborhood and was apparently designed for a completely different location. We give in, but my father won't let this go without them knowing never to screw with him again. He starts calling and emailing them regularly to demand to know when the next HOA meeting is and berate them for not properly notifying the neighborhood by email or even regular mail and newsletters. Pretty sure this is a violation of their regulations, but they might be just barely fulfilling them with the half-butt posting the day before the meetings mentioned earlier. He then starts attending every meeting and recording them. I join him and I pretend to be unrelated to make it appear that more people were upset with them. Turns out they've been ticking people off all over the neighborhood, including refusing to let a family dispose of a diseased tree ruining their lot. I don't recall all the details, but I think the tree wasn't actually on their property, but rather an empty lot or a condemned lot next door, but it was damaging their garden and property. Doing nothing to deal with a hornet nest on a block set of mailboxes. The mailboxes are all set up in one conjoined block of boxes. That was causing the mail person to refuse to deliver the mail there, causing people to miss bills and important mail. Forcing at least 2 other houses who did the same as us to repaint in those crappy colors. My dad met with these people and he gathered their contact info. We had planned to organize with other angry neighbors to stage a coup once elections came around. After the first meeting, my father took the information he'd gathered on the people in charge of the HOA, took to the internet, and found much more. The second meeting he goes to, he shows with name placards for all of them so that the neighborhood could know not only their names and positions, they couldn't be bothered to do this themselves, but also their addresses and phone numbers, letting them know he knows who they are and where they live. This, on top of his harassment by email and phone and their office, to the point that they had hired security guards to protect them from an angry old gun-owning man, must have been too much for this group of 30-something soccer moms. The next meeting, there's new HOA people. The president, vice president, and half the board have resigned. Turns out they were all a clique that used the HOA as more of a social club than a serious thing. My father is satisfied, and the new board starts taking action to actually help people in the neighborhood. Commenter says, your dad should start a business called HOA Busters, where he goes to a neighborhood that's being terrorized and gets them to resign or vote out. He could also have people filming him. I would watch that show. This is a 3-story saga about a nasty HOA Karen and the drama with OP. Darling Debbie and her spouse. Debbie lived directly behind our house. She lived alone except when her husband, Fred, came to mow the lawn, do yard work, and get yelled at in the yard in front of the entire neighborhood. There were several occasions that made us more than a little concerned. Whenever Fred came over, the neighbors on the street that she lived on would call all their children into the house. I mean, one minute there would be 8 to 10 kids playing, and then ghost town. This is because Debbie would go out front to greet Fred in a very bitter manner. The following conversation took place on a beautiful Saturday morning. Fred getting out of his car, "Hey." Debbie cutting him off, "Where the heck have you been? I've been waiting all freaking morning." But honey, it's only 9 a.m. Debbie cuts him off again. "Exactly, you should have been here at 7. Well, I said I'd be here at 9, and I'm freaking here. Shut the heck up." Debbie throwing the newspaper at Fred. "Don't you freaking talk to me like that. I'm your wife. Now get your butt to work." These were their normal conversations. Sometimes they were much worse. Another Saturday morning, we noticed Fred sitting on the patio in a lawn chair. He was visibly ill. His face was beet red, and we were concerned that he was having a heart attack or a stroke. Debbie was not going to allow her husband to sit idle while he still had chores to attend. She berated him mercilessly until he just got up, didn't say one word, and left. He was back about 2 weeks later. Debbie hired 2 handymen to enclose the lanai. They put windows up in the peak of the roof and 5 sets of sliding glass doors all the way around. It was so much nicer to look at from a neighbor's perspective. Debbie is somewhat of a hoarder and had so much junk on her lanai, it was so nice once we didn't have to look at things that she picked out of the trash. Not against dumpster diving or upcycling, but she never did anything with the stuff. By far, the most disturbing incident with Debbie and Fred happened on a Saturday. Fred only came to do chores on Saturday, and the rest of the time, he lived in a small apartment alone. After Debbie had had the lanai enclosed, Fred hadn't been over for a few weeks, and he was furious with Debbie when he saw the work that had been done. We couldn't see them since the lanai was enclosed and had blinds in between the glass on all the sliding glass doors, but we could hear them. Fred goes, "What the heck did you do?" "I had to get something. I couldn't just look at the neighbor's ugly yard anymore," referring to our yard. "You never even asked me. This cost me $15,000. Where am I supposed to get the freaking money?" Fred is actually retired. Now, screaming in a language that I don't understand, Debbie goes off. And after what truly sounds like fighting, they come out into the yard. Debbie has collected every piece of wood that the contractors hadn't used and every piece of scrap that they cut and were going to discard. "What am I supposed to do?" Fred says. "I need you to cut all this wood 2x4s so that I can burn it in the fire pit." "I didn't know that's what you needed today. I don't have a table saw with me. I'm going to have to come back next weekend to cut this wood." "I have a saw you can use." "Where'd you get a saw?" "One of the construction men left it one night and I took it." Debbie goes into the house and comes out with a handsaw. Fred goes, "This won't work. It'll take a week to cut all this wood with this little saw." "Then we need to get started." Fred tries again to explain why this just won't work, but in the end, he attempts to cut up some of the wood. Now Debbie only has the saw and none of the other equipment needed to safely cut wood, but they attempt to improvise. There is a small concrete bench in the yard. Debbie places a piece of lumber on the bench and stands on the board so that Fred can saw it down to a manageable size for Debbie to burn. This was pretty amusing to watch for a while, until Fred just stopped and told Debbie that he can't do this by hand. Debbie insisted he try again, and Fred complied, and while he was sawing, Debbie jumped off the board and it snapped back and hit Fred in the head. Fred's head is now bleeding profusely. Fred goes, "What the heck did you do that for?" "You need to listen to me. When I tell you to do something, you do it." "Well, I can't work now. I have to go to the hospital." Debbie picks up the board and holds it like a baseball bat. "What are you doing now?" "You can't leave. You're not finished. You can go when all the wood is cut." Fred had enough. Debbie is blocking his path to leave. Fred just backs up and goes around the house to his car. This part was relayed by another neighbor, and as Fred got into his car, Debbie came running from the backyard and hit Fred's car with a 2x4. Fred flipped her the one-finger salute as he peeled out of the driveway. Debbie never got the wood cut. She attempted to burn the 6-foot lengths of lumber in her small fire pit, until the fire department and police showed up because of the smoke. That's Debbie. Demanding Debbie never liked us. Posted by SnooMuffins9396. Backstory: Spring 2015, and we were relocating from the East Coast to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. We were moving into a hot market, and houses were getting 12 to 20 offers each. Super stressful for buyers. We had looked at dozens of houses in the area, and we were outbid on all of our offers. My husband decided that we needed to up our price to find something decent. We asked our agent to show us something in a beautiful neighborhood within our new price point. We walk into a beautiful home. The kitchen was almost perfect. It was a designer spec home, meaning the builder built the home without a specified buyer in hand to finish the block and move to the next section of the subdivision. The designer who chose the finishes really did a phenomenal job. The house had nearly $150,000 and more in upgrades. In our initial walk around the property, we see a lady, Debbie the Karen, come out of the house behind us and just stare. I waved at her because I wanted to make a good impression on our possible neighbor, but she just stared at us. We exit the front door and go back to the sales office with the keys to speak with the salespeople. They were super helpful, and I mean really helpful. They explained that the house had been completed almost 6 months earlier, and they haven't had any legitimate offers that the builder would accept. They gave my husband the breakdown of all the upgrades and what the house was initially listed at, and each price reduction and date. We asked about the lady behind the house, and they all rolled their eyes and laughed. said she was harmless but a major pain in the behind. As we left, the salesman told us what the last offer was on the house and said to just go a little above it and we would be fine. We went to lunch with our agent to look over everything about the house, and we loved it and decided to make an offer. Our offer was accepted and we got a great deal. From the initial listing price to our offer, we saved over $175,000. Now it should have been a huge red flag that they were willing to let this property go at that price. After we move in, we meet the neighbors next door, Jim and Amanda, and they are lovely people. But we only see Debbie come out to stare at us and our house. Jim and Amanda tell us that Debbie was one of the original homeowners in the subdivision, and they were too, and that Debbie has scared away countless potential buyers for our house and the house next door by staring and making people uncomfortable. Everyone else we met was very welcoming. Things with Debbie started slow at first. We needed to put up a fence for our dogs. We had approval from the HOA, and the day that our contractor arrived to start installing fence posts, Debbie lost her ever-loving mind. HOA rules stated that the fence must be put right on the property line and that we had to install a 4-foot-high split rail fence with hog wire for the dogs, not a privacy fence. That is exactly what we were putting up. Debbie tried claiming that we were trying to put our fence on her property and she was calling the police. The police show up with sirens and lights and the whole show. She called 911, and Debbie is screaming that the fence installers were threatening to kill her. The contractor and I are just standing on my deck trying not to laugh. She said we were calling her really offensive names. We weren't, and that we were trespassing in her yard. The officer asked Debbie to point out who said what, and she proceeds to point at 3 of the fence installers. The second officer approaches us to get our side, and the contractor shows that we have HOA approval and the survey showing all property lines, and tells him that the 3 men she is accusing of harassment speak limited English. So no way they've said anything to her. Then Debbie doubles down with the trespassing and trying to say that we were putting our fence on her property. The officers ask to see the property pins, and my contractor tells them that Debbie pulled them up herself as soon as she saw where the fence would be constructed. The officer found the pins in Debbie's yard. Turns out, Debbie had been encroaching onto our property for years. Her house was built about 7 years before ours, and she had been planting about 6 feet past the property lines. We got our fence installed about 4 inches shy of the property line, and Debbie received a warning for pulling property pins. Now, as a side note, this is obviously a well-to-do neighborhood with many houses in excess of $2 million, and Debbie used empty beer bottles buried neck down as her border for various planting beds. She did this to keep the water out. When the fence was complete and I had the task to remove all the beer bottles, Debbie watched me the whole time, I asked her if she wanted them back, and she never answered, demanding Debbie does laundry. Debbie was the neighbor directly behind our property. Our HOA didn't allow us to put up any kind of permanent clothesline. Temporary lines were okay, and this did not deter Debbie. Every week, year-round, Debbie would wash her clothes in a very large stock pot on a hot plate on her covered lanai. Think Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies. She also did all of her cooking outside on the hot plate, and then hang them to dry on her outdoor furniture, draped over bushes and even on our fence. My poor husband would get too embarrassed to ask her to please stop hanging her underwear and bras on our fence, so I had to approach her. I asked her to please hang her things somewhere else because I was worried that our dogs might pull them off the fence and damage her clothing. Debbie looked at me incredulously and said that she could use her side of the fence any way she liked. We don't want to get our neighbors in trouble with the HOA, but this lady was purposely pushing all our buttons. We took a few photos of her laundry and contacted the HOA to ask if anything can be done. When they asked for the address and the name of the resident, the HOA rep just sighed. Apparently, they had been dealing with Debbie for a long time. They said they would contact her and for us to let them know if she does anything to retaliate. The HOA contacted us about 2 weeks later and informed us that if she hangs anything on our fence again, that we could do whatever we wanted with the items. Debbie hung her laundry on our fence a few weeks later, and after she went back into her house, I walked into my yard with my dogs and I grabbed one item and I went back into my home. I did this every time she hung something on our fence. Debbie never questioned me about it. Neighbors told me that she believed that there was some kind of underwear thief roaming the neighborhood and to be on the lookout. Now, I didn't touch her clothing with my bare hands, and I only handled it with a glove. I put all of her clothing in a box in our garage in case she ever asked me. I put the full box, a large shoebox with about 7 items, on her side of the fence about a week before we moved away. And FYI, the HOA was extremely reasonable. They would send letters and rarely ever find residents. Debbie had called the police for the most mundane things, and I didn't want to get her in any kind of legal trouble, and I also don't like bothering the authorities with this kind of petty stuff. The name Demanding Debbie is only used as an alliteration. Her name isn't Debbie, but she would often make ridiculous demands on the neighbors. Debbie Downer's a Karen. Have you ever had to deal with somebody like this? Holy cow, man. Neighbor and HOA harassment, posted by Sean B. for Life. My coworker's neighbor behind him has been reporting him to their HOA for months now, getting them fined for literally nothing. The latest issue was having a fire pit on the back porch. The bylaw mentions you can't have an open fire or have fire pits in use, but grills are allowed. But the issue here is that the fire pit is not in use. Also, the picture presented to show the fireplace on the back porch comes from that neighbor's security camera that is directly pointed at his house. The entire view of the camera is all of only his property and nothing else. The houses are separated by a drivable alleyway too. This neighbor spies on him regularly. He sees him looking out at them all the time, day and night. And also, he trespasses on people's property to find reasons to report them. I told him to fight it because he's spying, privacy breaching, and the bylaw doesn't say that you can't own one or have one out, and harassment. Any other advice? A question and update from OP. Has he got children and have them out playing in the rear yard when he uses a grill? Then lay a charge of the neighbor creating inappropriate videos. OP replies, my coworker is in college renting the house with 7 other people. They all stay inside mostly and are quiet from the info that I'm given. This entire neighborhood is right next to their college. The position of the camera gathered from the photo evidence of breaking the bylaw has direct view of the back door, so every time it opens, you can see inside the entirety of the camera view, and from all shows only the upper half of my coworker's backyard, along with his entire house. It does not show the alley street in between their houses or the owner of the camera's backyard. Are these normal houses in a suburb? Or are the HOAs gated communities with townhouses or something? Someone asked, and OP replied, it's a 3-street subdivision in a larger neighborhood. It's not gated. Wow, they seem incredibly intrusive for just a small house in a suburb. I get condos with shared common property needing them. They're seen as the downside of owning a condo and apartment here. Maybe because housing estates in the US have to maintain stuff that is maintained by the local council in other countries. The final update. So far now, he has been charged with the following. Having a fire pit in view on the back porch. The bylaw states it can't be lit that close to the house. And we're fined for it being lit, which it wasn't, and without evidence. Having a hammock drilled into the tree in their backyard, but it was one of those wraparound tension ones. This had something to do about the destruction of the landscape. Continuous complaints about different cars parked in the driveway. I don't know how this is even a thing, but when you have 7 college students renting a house, it should be expected. Continuous noise complaints. Their neighbors on both sides throw parties all the time, so the HOA groups them all together. And the most recent was a fine for having the grill on the front porch. It was never on the front porch. I helped them move in and I took it straight to the back porch. It's too big and too heavy to just move to their tiny front porch. All of this is without any proof, and most of these fines are from bylaws that don't exist or what they wish they wrote in but didn't. As in, they have no grounds for these fines. All of them have been $50 to $100, which they have refused to pay and are usually dropped. The latest one with the grill was $750. Pretty steep in my eyes for an HOA fine. They even mentioned in their emails about the fire pit that the grill is the only thing allowed on the back porch and it never left the back porch. It is clear they're being targets by the HOA and their rear neighbor. Their landlord at this point is tired of the complaints and wants them all out. This feels like a group thing, like they're all in on it. I told him to take legal action. Is there any legal action to take? Any ground to stand on? I know HOAs can pretty much do what they want sometimes. HOA takedown. HOA destroys my property, but I'm not even part of the HOA. Click the video on your screen so you don't miss this crazy fallout, and I'll see you there.